Hello and welcome to the Space Advisory Podcast. My name is Wanyana Racheal and I am thrilled to have you join us today. Through this podcast, we aim to provide authoritative and incisive commentary at the intersection of space law and security. In today's episode, we'll be discussing global counterspace capabilities and trends, and our guest is none other than Victoria Samson. Victoria is the Chief Director of Space Security and Stability at the Secure World Foundation. She has more than 25 years of experience in military space and security issues, and she is the lead co-author of the 2025 Global Counterspace Capabilities Report. We are very delighted to have you today, Victoria.
Thank you so much for having me. I really do appreciate it.
It is a pleasure to have you. Thank you, Victoria. And to kick off this conversation, you have been at the forefront of mapping key technological trends shaping counter space capabilities over the last 8 years. And in the 2025 report, which came out in April this year, you note that an increasing number of countries are looking to develop or enhance their counter space capabilities to be able to deceive, disrupt, deny, degrade or destroy space systems of their peers. So, what are some of the most significant new developments or shifts that you're seeing emerging in counter space capabilities research and development?
Yeah, well, great question, and thank you so much for having me on your podcast. When we started this counter space report 8 years ago, part of the incentive was we were getting asked all sorts of questions about what countries were doing, specifically Russia and China. And it would just be either wildly speculative, kind of like, oh my God, the end of the world is happening. Or it'd be like, well, can't really say much, but if only you knew, it's classified, but if only you knew, you'd be really threatened. And so we thought, okay, well, let's try and figure out what can we find out from an unclassified perspective, and how does that compare to what other countries are doing? You really to put it in context, so it's not happening in and of itself. So when we started our report in 2018, we had 6 countries. It was about, and included the United States, Russia, China, India, Iran, North Korea. And it was about 150 pages. Our most recent version of the report came out in April 2025. It's now 12 countries. It's well over 300 pages. And so you can just see it's expanded greatly. And in fact, next year's report, we're thinking we're going to have to add 2 more countries. So, one of the trends that we're seeing is an increased interest in research and development of some sort of counter space capabilities. And I think that really speaks to how important space capabilities are to countries, both from a national security, but also from an economical perspective, in terms of, it's so crucial to how the countries run, that, the concern is that any kind of interruption to deny, degrade, disrupt, destroy the access to space services or capabilities can be truly a national security concern. So that's one of the big things we're seeing. One of the things that we've seen as well is that pretty much everyone is interested in some sort of electronic warfare, whether that's, jamming, GPS or spoofing, information, things like that. That's definitely happening. Cyber capabilities, in terms of cyber counterspace capabilities, that's also happening. And, those are seen, perceived as being very usable counterspace capabilities. And I mean that deliberately, in terms of that can be done by any actor. It's not seen as particularly escalatory. It doesn't necessarily require a military response. You have plausible deniability in terms of who's doing it. And as opposed to something that's like a direct ascent anti-satellite capability, where you have an interceptor launch from ground territory to attack a satellite. I mean, you pretty much know. You're like, okay, we can trace where the interceptor came from. We know who did it. But electronic warfare, and particularly cyber, like, you plausible deniability. And so it's something that can be done a lot easier, as opposed to something that's going to be, destroying a satellite and affecting the space environment and making it more challenging for yourself to operate in.
Yeah, that's very interesting what you say about the non-kinetic capabilities, them being ambiguous, very hard to attribute, but then also being the most used at the moment. And I also do believe that as they become more sophisticated, and given the strategic nature of space, they might pose as much destructive potential as kinetic technologies or capabilities. And you have been following the multilateral discourse on space security in general, but then also space governance. What does regulation look like for these technologies? How are the questions of attribution, for example, deterrence and accountability being approached? Are there any norms taking shape in this regard about what is the acceptable threshold or the non-acceptable thresholds?
Yeah, so over the past 5 years or so, there's been more of an interest in discussing this at the multilateral level in terms of thinking about, okay, what sort of responsible behaviors do we want to see? Historically, for decades now, the UN, nations has been stuck in kind of a feedback loop of whether, they should be looking at, and they talk about prevention of arms race in outer space or PAROS. Whether that means looking at actual weapons that are designed to be weapons to be placed into space, or which is what countries like Russia and China have been very concerned about. And they've proposed a treaty that would ban the prevention and placement of those weapons in outer space, or whether you should be looking at behaviors in terms of activities, because so much of space technology is just tool purpose. It can be used to, a lot, for example, a space asset that can be used to do active debris removal. In terms of the satellite, can go up to another satellite and get rid of a dead satellite or what have you. That can also be used as a co-orbital counterspace capability. It can go up to another satellite and remove it, whether you want to or not. And so the concern by some countries is that, okay, what you need to be looking at is behaviors as opposed to technology. And so it doesn't really necessarily help to ban technologies because either everything's a weapon or nothing's a weapon. And it's not really a helpful way to look at these sort of things. And so the UN for decades has been stuck in this loop, treaty, no treaty, weapon, no weapon. How do you deal with this? And so about 5 years ago, they kind of got out of that a little bit and they started looking, okay, how do you look at behaviors? We want to stop looking at this sort of thing. And I think that's where we start to see some forward movement, and it's still, I don't want, I could bore people stupid by talking by minutia about UN discussions. I won't. I could, but I won't. But I think we've started to see some forward behavior in terms of these sort of things, and that you're seeing kind of a general almost consensus arriving, and that's considered, a couple things. That's considered to be bad form to deliberately create debris in orbit, whether that's, shooting down your own satellite or what have you. It's considered bad form to do these uncoordinated close approaches to other country satellites. You're trying to act with due regard. You're trying to act with, trying not to threaten other country satellites. So we're starting to see that sort of thing emerge, which is important because as we're seeing the use of space evolve, and as we're seeing, more countries enter into space, there's a possibility for, invert escalation. So it's really important to have a common understanding of what these behaviors can be. So I think it's helpful. I don't think we're going to see a treaty anytime soon. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. As long as you have an understanding in terms of the major space actors of what's considered responsible behavior, I think it can be just as helpful to make the space environment secure, stable, and predictable for the long term.
That's very interesting and very important what you say about the emerging consensus on certain behavior, for example, around acting with due regard to the interests of other states, not creating space debris or non-cooperative or rendezvous and proximity operations. But I think it is important for us to talk about the fact that uh, even with this progress, and even within the areas where consensus is almost universal, there are still notable contestations around what responsible behavior actually entails. For instance, how close is too close when approaching, sorry, when approaching state satellite, another state satellites. At the moment, I think there is no universally acceptable minimum distance for approaching another state satellites. And the situation is still governed by technical considerations that prioritize non-interference and space safety, but not the strategic concerns that might arise from the approaching. And also, I sometimes do get the impression that there are overlaps between international space law and state practice or the reality. For example, on the one hand, there is emerging consensus about not creating debris. Then on the other, we have some countries conducting anti-satellite tests and creating significant amounts of debris. And then, in the case of the Outer Space Treaty, on the other hand, it bans the placement of weapons of mass destruction in outer space. But then, on the other, as you said earlier, it does not explicitly prohibit the placement of conventional weapons in space. And neither does it prohibit the launching of weapons from Earth to target an asset in outer space. So, which means there is still room to adopt varying definitions of what responsible behavior is to fit, of course, the interests of the proposing countries. And this leads me to the question, what is realistically achievable when it comes to norm building and also building consensus on the contested areas about what is and what is not acceptable?
Yeah, I mean, the 1967 Outer Space Treaty, it's the bedrock of international law in regards to space. And I think the principles that it encapsulates are still very relevant to this day. I'm not a lawyer, but you're talking to lawyers, everything is always like, it depends, right? How do you interpret the law in regards to the evolving use of space? And that's really the question mark here. So I think, it's I'm not one of the people that wants to, change the outer space treaty. I think it's very helpful. Just like, okay, how do the principles apply to this new circumstances? Um, so, for example, as you mentioned, the idea of Article 4 of the Outer Space Treaty says you cannot place weapons of mass destruction in outer space. You cannot put them in orbit. And that was done, deliberately in acknowledgement, frankly, to the Cold War situation at the time when the US and the Soviet Union both were thinking at some point they might have to launch nuclear armed intercontinental ballistic missiles at each other. And so if that were the case, you'd have, nuclear weapons in space kind of arcing through as they go to the other target. But the idea of conflict, but we don't want them actually stationed in space for long term because it's very destabilizing. Um, Both the US and the Soviet Union, in fact, tested nuclear weapons in space during the early parts of the Cold War. And we know from that, how damaging that can be to satellites that are up there. The United States in July of 1962 tested a nuclear warhead in an exercise was called Starfish Prime. It was a very big nuclear warhead, it was 1.4 megatons, and basically it wiped out about a third of the active satellites that were in orbit at the point. Now, granted, we're 5 years post Sputnik at that point, so there weren't that many, but still. Um, and the reason why I bring this up is that, in 2024, news emerged that the United States believed Russia to be developing a nuclear warhead with the idea that it would be placed into space to be used in anti-satellite capacity. And um, and so it's stabilizing. So I think the concepts that are involved in the outer space treaty is still very relevant to this day. Um, Also, as well, there's these things called the Artemis Accords. That's where the United States has pulled out principles from the Outer Space Treaty and saying, okay, here's how we think they apply to peaceful exploration of the moon and other celestial bodies. And it looks at things like transparency and sharing of scientific data and things like that. And I think about 55 countries have signed on the Artemis Accords. Now, they're not legally binding, but they're really saying, okay, these are the principles of the Outer Space Treaty, and here's how they apply as we continue to evolve in new space. So I think it is helpful. Having said that, there are some gaps. For example, the Outer Space Treaty does not prevent any country from testing anti-satellite weapons. It does not prevent the deliberate creation of debris in outer space. And so that I think that's when you're talking about responsible behaviors. That's when you're saying, okay, here's principles of the Outer Space Treaty, the idea of acting with due regard of other actors and not doing harmful interference and things like that. Here's how they apply in the continued evolution of research space. And that's why it's really important to have international discussions like what are happening in the United Nations and things of that nature to be able to say, okay, here's how we think these bedrock principles apply in these new evolutions in use of space.
Yeah, and as you shared that brief history about the anti-satellite tests, you come to realize a number of spacefaring nations have conducted these. But also, you look for case law in this regard, and there is little to nothing, which, in my opinion, is reflective of the power of the politics around international law. I mean, there seems to be a hesitancy or political taboo among state nations regarding the invocation of international law, especially when it comes to questions of liability. For example, you mentioned the U.S. anti-satellite test, which obliterated almost every space system at the time, and recently in 2007 we had the Chinese anti-satellite test. I earlier on spoke about the Russian anti-satellite test, and all these incidents have left behind significant amount of debris fragments, which could have affected other satellites or which did affect other satellites. There was also the Iridium Cosmos collision, which similarly raised issues of negligence and compensation. Yet, no formal diplomatic settlement mechanisms were ever invoked. And I think this reveals a sort of a political sensitivity around attributing blame in the context of space. But it could also reveal how geopolitical considerations eclipse legal remedies. So, again, drawing from your experience following these issues closely for the last 25 years, how are states receiving, for example, you talked about the Artemis Accord, how are geopolitical forces influencing how these laws are received and later on applied?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things that's been interesting. The Outer Space Treaty Article 9 allows you to have discussions with other countries. If you think they're going to be doing something that's going to be harmful to your interests, you can say, okay, we think this is happening. We'd like to have consultations. Um, that Article 9 has very rarely been invoked. I think it may have been invoked one time, and then since 1967. And so I think that's not, in my opinion, if I were more countries, I'd invoke it more. Yeah, these laws and treaties are only as helpful as their implementation. But I think the reason why a lot of countries have not invoked it is they're worried about creating a precedent. We say, okay, we invoke Article 9 and we call country X to task and say, okay, we want to have consultations in terms of what your activities are in this case, then we leave ourselves open to having that done in return. And that other countries will invoke Article 9 in regards to our behaviors and activities in outer space and want to talk to us. And we don't want to start that precedent. But I think, at some point that it's going to be really important to have these discussions just because so much of behaviors in space they can be again misinterpreted. They can you can have activities that one country may think would be just normal station keeping behaviors or things of that nature that are not necessarily meant to be threatening or creating a hazard in space. But other countries may take those behaviors as being done deliberately as an affront to them, and interpret them accordingly and respond accordingly. And so I think that's not going to be helpful. For example, one place where we've seen that happen is 3 years ago in January 2022, China had a satellite geostationary orbit that was inactive, and shedding pieces of debris. Now, geostationary orbit is a very well-regulated orbit. There's a lot of very expensive satellites there. Spectrum is very carefully managed at that level. And so China sent a satellite up to take that dead satellite out of the orbit and to take it to a really high graveyard orbit. Um, Now, some countries can look at that and say, look, China was acting in a responsible manner. They had a satellite that was a hazard to other satellites and they got rid of the hazard. Or some countries can look at that behavior and say, China has proven that they have a global counterspace capability because they were able to get an uncooperative satellite out of its orbit and move it out of its way. So I think that's where, sharing information about intentions and goals is going to be really important to be able to shape the conversation so you don't have a misunderstanding of what actions are happening actually in orbit.
Yeah, sharing information is very important, especially in a context like space, because there are also questions of differing strategic cultures. where sometimes certain actions by certain states may be misunderstood or misread to constitute intention to harm, when in actual sense there is no such intention. And this is why I find these principles to be very delicate, because these are very gray areas. For instance, how do you define or demonstrate intent? And much as there is information sharing, there is also no guarantee that the information shared is information of integrity and as such can be relied upon. So these are some of the issues that make me wonder about the feasibility of multilateral cooperation and the applicability of these principles in outer space.
Yeah, I mean that's a really good question. How do you demonstrate good intent, right? And there's no common way of showing it. But that's where I think yeah, transparency can be helpful. And, for some countries, that's just kind of an anathema. They're not comfortable with transparency. But I think it can be really helpful. And so if you can have policies you can demonstrate, if you can, if you have an activity you're going to be doing that might be considered threatening, if you can share information ahead of time in terms of what your goals are and what your plans are and the timeline, and then share information about whether you're able to accomplish that sort of thing, I think it can be very helpful to alleviate concerns other countries may have about this sort of activity. I will point out, for example, Astroscale, it's a Japanese company that is looking to develop active debris removal technologies. And again, as I said before, a technology, a satellite that can do active debris removal can be also perceived as having a co-orbital counterspace capability. But Astroscale has been very open. They've had a couple tests leading up to their technology demonstration next year where they're going to try and remove a satellite from orbit. And they've said, okay, here's what we're planning on doing. Here's when we're planning on doing it. Here's the sort of things we're going to be doing. And here's what happened at the end. And so I think that's done a lot to alleviate concerns. Of course, as well, you have political perceptions of the country doing the activities, coloring how you look at that. So you can never fully cut off geopolitical, concerns from these things, but you can help kind of mitigate this a little bit. And I think also as well, if you have discussions at the multilateral level where you have common understandings of what's considered responsible behavior, then you as a nation state can say, okay, we are doing the things that the international community has agreed to as being responsible. We've provided points of contact. We've shared information about, what our satellites going to be doing. We are going to be telling you about any kind of close approaches. And so you can point to that and say, okay, we're doing all the things the national community has identified as being responsible behavior, and that can help a little bit. You're never going to get rid of geopolitical tensions, but you can help mitigate those concerns tremendously.
Yeah, unfortunately, we cannot do away with the geopolitics for better, for worse. And I think it's only going to get worse with the growing competition and also as space becomes a more strategic frontier upon which we are relying on for strategic for security purposes, but also everyday life. But moving forward, 10 years, 20 years from now, I mean, we already have new concepts emerging like the Golden Dome. We have the bodyguard satellites. What do you think the next generation of counter space threats or defenses will look like in 10 years or 20 years from now?
Yeah, I think one of the things we're seeing more and more is there kind of a blurring between satellites that can do kind of space situational awareness or SSA capabilities and those that can do co-orbital capabilities. So a satellite that can be in orbit and travel around, let's say, the geostationary belt to keep an eye on other objects in orbit. That can also be, so providing an SSA or space situation awareness capability, that can also provide a co-orbital capability. And so we're starting to see kind of a blurring between those two. The satellite being launched, and you're like, is it meant to do SSA? Is it meant to do co-orbital? Is it meant to move around? Like, so that sort of thing is happening a lot more. And so it's getting more and more complicated. We're seeing as well kind of a combination of electronic warfare and cyber counterspace activities. Oftentimes, I'll be reading about, a cyber attack that allowed for jamming and spoofing. And I'm like, wait, is that electronic warfare? Is it cyber or something? So those are kind of going hand in hand as well. So I think also looking ahead, as you mentioned before, if the United States does do its Golden Dome plans, which includes a space-based interceptor layer, as a boost phase missile defense intercept. The Golden Dome interceptors, they may not be, I think we have a whole other podcast conversation about how effective they might be in terms of missile defense capabilities. But, those are actually interceptors placed in orbit and they can point up as well as pointing down. So they could be developing it as an anti-satellite capacity. Now, having said that, I think it's going to take a long time to develop that kind of technology. So we're not going to see it anytime soon. But there is a possibility that the United States will have that up eventually. Um, and if the United States has a space-based interceptor layer, I don't know necessarily that Russia would develop one accordingly, but I think perhaps the Chinese would be interested in developing one as well. And so what we might see are, thousands of interceptors placed in orbit, already complicating a very complicated space environment. So I think definitely we're going to see that. And then looking ahead as well, I think as more and more countries depend upon space for national security missions, they're also going to be incentivized to develop some sort of counter space capability, not necessarily destructive counter space capabilities, but developing the ability to do electronic warfare, jamming, that sort of thing. And so I think we'll continue to see the proliferation of counter space interests globally.
Yeah, and do you think the international law frameworks would have evolved to be able to address these challenges, or will we be still playing catch up?
Yeah, I think it'll be both, which sounds like a very, I'm playing the odds here, but I think we're going to see both international law playing catch up, but maybe getting ahead of some of the concerns. International law is playing catch up in terms of counter space capabilities in Earth orbit, and and that's not specific to space. Oftentimes, just technology evolves a lot faster than policies can keep up with it, so that's not new. Um, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. It just means we have to really focus on getting these discussions moving ahead. But where it can actually be ahead of the game is as there are more actors doing activities around the moon and in and around the moon, I think there's a possibility of getting ahead of that conversation and setting the precedent in terms of, hey, here's the sort of behaviors that we want to see that are from responsible space actors in and around the moon, and that can help shape that conversation so that we can start as we plan to go on and not have activities on the moon be perceived as particularly escalatory or causing conflict here on Earth.
Yeah, and that's a brilliant note for us to bring this conversation to an end. Thank you very much, Victoria, for your insights and for making time to speak to us today.
Oh, it was my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. I really do appreciate it.